Hi SALT users, this is Joelle with SALT Software, and in this video I'm going to be going over an introduction to SALT software and language sample analysis. So kind of think of this as SALT 101. What we'll do today is talk about elicitation protocols within SALT software and how to collect a valid and robust language sample. We'll demonstrate how to analyze a sample through a case study, and then at the end I'll go through some helpful resources for you. So let's talk about why language sample analysis should be part of your diagnostic toolkit. The first reason that I think of is that it can often substantiate the reason for referral that you might be getting from teachers and parents. If you collect a sample and run some data, you're going to get a profile of strengths and weaknesses, and oftentimes those weaknesses can put data around kind of the parent and teacher concerns. So you have some information to describe those deficits. Language sample analysis uses the whole language system, so this can be great for augmenting standardized testing, which if we think about standardized tests, we're kind of looking at factions of language, so we might be looking at morphology, we might be looking at semantics in isolation, but when we use a language sample, we're looking at how the speaker uses their whole language system when they're having a conversation or doing a narrative story retell. Also, language samples can be pretty unbiased and culturally responsive. We'll do a conversational sample where we can talk about anything that we like. We're using books for narrative retells and expositories. Expository and persuasive samples with older students. Language sample analysis can also be great for monitoring change over time. It's pretty simple to collect a sample and then do the same type of sample later and see if there is progress after therapy. And also, there's a great time-benefit ratio. So, language sample analysis, then why use SALT software? One of the strengths of SALT is the normative databases, our reference databases. We have databases where you can compare your sample to typically developing peers, age preschool all the way through high school. And also, if you're a clinician working with bilingual speakers, we have a large and robust database containing bilingual samples. Our results are fast. A couple clicks in and you're going to get your measures. There's easy analysis and interpretation. We kind of guide that through our reports for you. You can also apply additional coding, which will yield more information. So you can do the SI, or the subordination index, that looks at clausal density and get normative data on clausal density. We also have the narrative scoring scheme and persuasive expository scoring scheme, which look at the structure and content of narrative retells, exposition, and persuasion samples. And also on our newest version, we have assistance with report writing and goals that are ready to go for you. So the whole process of language sample analysis using SALT is a 5-part process. So what you're going to do first is choose your sample type. You want to look at the databases and grade and pick which sample. Review the sampling protocol, so you're following the elicitation protocol. You're going to collect and record your sample. And what I typically use is just an iPad or some sort of digital recorder, and that gives us great audio quality. And then you can transcribe your sample yourself or have SALT transcribe it for you. And then the last part is to analyze and interpret your sample. So let's go over some elicitation kind of pitfalls and tips. So what we want to do is follow the SALT software elicitation protocol very closely so we have a valid comparison if you plan on comparing your language sample transcript to the SALT database. You can, of course, collect any sort of sample that you want, but if you're doing a database comparison, it really needs to be an apples to apple comparison by administering and collecting that sample in a standard way. So some pitfalls that we see once in a while is veering away from the elicitation protocol. So if a student is doing a narrative retell and then the clinician starts asking lots of questions and it turns into a conversation, that can be a bit tricky. It's not truly a narrative retell, it's not truly a conversation. So just make sure that you're familiar with the protocols and following them to get a valid sample. We also sometimes get too much examiner talking. We want the sample to be more child-led. If we're doing a conversation, we definitely want that reciprocity, that back and forth with examiner and clinician, but we should have equal parts or less of examiner talk versus student talk, and then really keep comments and so forth to a minimum for elicitation protocols such as narrative story retells. The other kind of pitfall that we see once in a while is just an inappropriate elicitation. So really take into account the speaker's age and grade and their linguistic skills. We don't want to give a fifth grader an elicitation or a retell like "Frog, where are you?" that's meant for a kindergartner. That's going to be underwhelming for them and they're going to go off task. Conversely, we don't want to give a kindergartner an elicitation protocol like a expository that is meant for an older speaking student. So we have to find that just right level of elicitation protocol. So some kind of tips. Make sure that you familiarize yourself with the elicitation protocols, that you're picking a protocol that's age appropriate, and that you have your materials like your recorder, books if you're using them, ready to go. Another tip for eliciting a sample is don't be afraid of that awkward pause. Give the child or speaker time. Don't be afraid of a couple second pauses. And we recommend that active listening using affirmations like, oh, interesting. Short little snippets that show active listening like that, rather than overly prompting the speaker. And then the last thing to consider when you're picking your elicitation protocol is what clinical question do you want answered? What are your questions? If I have a student who are working on social pragmatic skills and they're having difficulty joining peers in conversation, I would pick a conversational sample to see how their reciprocity is at the conversational level. If we're concerned about children understanding like narrative structure and being able to sequence, then I would pick a narrative story retell. If you're working with older kids, you might opt for persuasion or an expository, something that is aligned with the Common Core, that is an upper elementary, high school level language skill. So think about what questions you have. On this slide, we've got all of our SALT reference databases, so there's a lot to pick from. The best way to approach this would be to go by grade level first, and then at that grade level, kind of choose which elicitation protocol that you want. So if we look at the upper left corner here, pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade, we have the narrative story retell of "Frog, Where Are You?" You can also do a play-based with like a farm set or a dollhouse play-based conversation, a regular conversation, a narrative student select story where they're picking a favorite book or movie to tell you about, and then there's also the test of narrative language samples. So that's pre-K through first grade. If I go on to second grade, we have the same conversation, narrative student selects, and T&L, but then the narrative story retell would be Pookin's Gets Her Way. In third grade, the narrative story retell is a porcupine named Fluffy. And then if we come on over here to older students, 4th through 5th grade, we'd want to use Dr. DeSoto, which is a little bit longer, more complex story. And then we've also got the expository, where students are telling their favorite game or sport, and they get to use a planning sheet. If you're working with an 8th grade student, we have the test of narrative language 2 narrative samples. And then we also have the Fables database, which is new. So this is a retell of Aesop's fable. And then there's also questions that go along with the fable. The Fables database was contributed by Marilyn Nipple at University of Oregon. And then if you're working with high school students, we've got expository and persuasion. So they're trying to persuade someone of something that they would like to see changed at school or at home. I'll briefly touch on the Spanish reference databases. If you are working with bilingual children, Spanish-English, we have the Frog Stories by Mercer Mayer, kindergarten through 3rd grade. We have these samples in Spanish and in English, so that's a great way to assess, is it language acquisition? Are they just learning English and need more time? Or are both English and Spanish samples low? So that's a great comparison because it's a bilingual database. It's children who are bilingual. And then we also have monolingual Spanish-only samples if you're interested using the Frog Stories 1st through 3rd grade. Okay, so then we just kind of got done going through. Okay, so we just finished going through all those elicitation protocols, and let's think about some of the measures, and does the protocol or the elicitation impact any of those language measures? And the answer is yes, it does. So this very colorful kind of squiggly line chart demonstrates mean length of utterance is on the y-axis here, and then age is on the x, and the different colors are the different elicitation protocols. So if we look, for example, at this green line, this is a conversation. And if we look at maybe a 10-year-old, their mean length of utterance in morphemes is about 7 when they're doing a conversation. But when we took the average of the SALT databases and looked at mean length of utterance for narrative story retell, it bumps up to an 11. That's a more linguistically complex task, and it requires more complex language. So that number is different, mean length of utterance. And you can also look if this one in the top right corner, kind of dark blue, that's persuasion. So this is from high school children, and their mean length of utterance is between like 18 and 19. So there's a big difference there based on our sampling context. So again, that's why we want to make sure that we're sticking to that elicitation protocol, and also that we're doing something that is developmentally appropriate. Let's look at another measure, which is number of different words, so kind of a reflection of vocabulary. And this is also very colorful, lots of squiggly lines here. But number of different words definitely changes over time. If we look at this teal line, the narrative story retell, the vocabulary really jumps up. So this is our 5-year-olds, and then it jumps up all the way almost to 80 for a 9-year-old. So number of different words is impacted by the elicitation protocol and age. The last one that we'll take a look at is the words per minute. So speaking rate. The speaking rate change based on sampling context and age. And this one looks a little bit more linear. But we can tell that if we look at, for example, the conversational samples from a 12-year-old is about a little bit like 110 words per minute. And then if we go all the way up to a narrative student select, so they're telling their favorite book or movie, it goes up to 150. So there are some kind of typical changes that we can expect from measures depending on our sampling context. What we'll do next is watch a demonstration of a clinician collecting a narrative story retell from a 5-year-old student. So kind of notice the examiner role and then the student role. So the examiner is going to briefly explain the task. The materials are ready to go. We have the book and the script, and there's kind of minimal participation. So we're going to have the student kind of lead her narrative and not be afraid to wait. And what the student is going to do is retell the story using their own words, and these are wordless picture books, and they kind of use the pages to guide their story. So let's go ahead and take a listen. I'm here with Carly, and Carly is how old?
5.
5 years old. Okay. And Carly...
5.5.
5.5. Oh, okay. All right, so what I want to do is find out how you tell stories. So I do, I've got my, this is our microphone, and that'll pick up our voices. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you this story, and then when I'm done, you get to tell it back to me using your own words. Okay. It's called Frog, Where Are You? By Mercer Mayer. Okay.
I made froggy noise.
I heard that. That's kind of funny. Okay, are you ready to listen?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. All right, here we go. So, once there was a boy who had a dog and a pet frog. Frog with him. They had some baby frogs, and one of them jumped towards the boy.
Aww, baby froggies.
Cute. The baby frog liked the boy and wanted to be his new pet. The boy and the dog were happy to have a new pet frog to take home. As they walked away, the boy and the frog said goodbye to his old frog and his family. The end. Okay, now, Miss Carly, it's time for you to tell the story. I can't wait to hear your story. So just do the best you can and use your own words. Go ahead.
Doggy looked into the bucket and there was a frog. The froggy jumped down and when the boy woke up, there's no more frogs in the jar. So he looked in his shoe, and the dog looked in the bucket and he got his head stuck. So the boy looked out the empty window and then the jar was heavy and the dog fell out of the window. The boy came out and it was mad.
Nice. Doing great.
And the bee's hive dropped. The frog had a mama and babies. One of them jumped to the boy, and it was his dad. And he has a new pet frog. All done.
All done. Wow, that was so good. Thank you. I loved hearing your story. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a good little snapshot of what it's like to collect a language sample, specifically a narrative story retell. And our little student, Carly, our 5-year-old, did a nice job on her retell, and it was even a little bit silly. So it's always fun working with kids. You never know what they're going to throw at you. So let's go on to transcribing. So that would be the next step after we have collected our sample. At the SALT office, we do offer transcription services, which is fee-based, but how that works essentially is you go on to the transcription website and then you upload your sample, and then we send you back the results of your sample. Some clinicians opt to do that, some school districts as well, so that is just something that we offer. And otherwise, we have tons of free training materials. So there's videos on YouTube that would show you kind of how to in a video format. And there's also, which I'll show you at the end, self-paced courses that can teach you how to transcribe. So if you kind of spend a little bit of time up front, it's a life skill. It's fairly easy once you learn the conventions. We tried to make it easy to mark enough where we get robust data, but not where we're marking every little thing in language, so the transcription is just too overwhelming. So there's self-paced courses. Okay, and then after we get through the transcription, what we're going to do is analyze and interpret our results. So there's kind of a general kind of process that I'll demonstrate. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at our transcript and run the standard measures report. And that's kind of the cover sheet. It covers different language domains like syntax and morphology, intelligibility, semantics. So that's kind of the springboard. And then based on that, you're going to run additional reports to find out more data, dig kind of that next level down. And then you can run the performance report and the goal report. So let's go ahead and do a quick demonstration with a case study on how to analyze and interpret a SALT transcript. Our case study is on a 3rd grade student named Cheyenne. Cheyenne is completing a narrative story retell of a porcupine named Fluffy. This is part of her comprehensive 3-year re-eval, and she has been on caseload receiving speech and language services.
To name him, they wanted to name him all different kind of names, but they named him Fluffy. Fluffy hair was sticking up like fluff. Fluffy was sticking onto the door. Fluffy was so fluffy that he put holes in the bed. Fluffy was white. Fluffy put holes in the umbrella. Fluffy was playing on a tree. The tree fell. Fluffy was down on his head. Fluffy was taking a shower for 15 minutes.
And here's our transcript that goes along with Cheyenne's language sample of a porcupine named Fluffy. Your initial impressions might include really long pause times, both within and between her utterances. She has mazes, which are those false starts, repetitions, and filled pauses. She also had some articulation errors, I think specifically in the R sound. So let's go ahead and do her analysis and see if it kind of matches our initial impressions. So since we followed the elicitation protocol, we're going to compare her sample to the SALT reference database. So you're going to go up to the database menu. Everything in the database menu is going to give you that normative comparative data on your reports. So I'm going to go ahead and select the database samples. So you're met with this dialog box, and generally what you can do is take the defaults. This will kind of look at your header and fill in as much of this as possible for you already. So we see that it's the narrative story retail database, and the subgroup is a porcupine named Fluffy. Age match, generally we do plus or minus 6 months, but you can kind of play around with that. You also have the option to do grade match, gender match. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Find Match Samples, and there are 24 samples that are matched by age. Our rule of thumb is that you want at least 20 samples, so that looks pretty good. And then step 3 is to equate the samples by length. So I'm going to select same number of total words, and then we have 22 samples, so that still looks good. Okay, over on the right-hand side, I tend to keep my standard deviation interval at 1. You can change it if you want. If you're working for a district and it's easier for you to kind of think about qualifying, if your criteria is 1.75, you can go ahead and change that. But for my preference, I like to keep it at 1, just so I have a general sense of areas that are possibly challenge and also strength. So then I go ahead and click OK. And then all of these reports are open to me now that I've selected my database. So as we said before, we're going to start with the standard measures report. And then the report based on, you'll get this pop up as well. So let's just take a minute to understand what a report is going to be based on. There's a few options. SALT already does the default, which is kind of the suggested, recommended option, but you can change this. So the report can be based on all, so that would be the entire transcript. It can be on equated, where you're going to reduce it and compare it to the same number of total words. Or you can do measure driven, so that's a combination of all utterances and then your equated ones. So what this means is if some language measures are calculated as a percentage or an average, those are going to be based on the entire transcript. And then if it's a count measure, like number of repetitions or number of errors, that's going to be equated by length. So it's kind of equalizing the opportunities as far as the database to your sample on measures that are count based. So if you select measure driven, it's going to be a combination and kind of do that piece for you. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then this is literally going and calculating all of the numbers live with the SALT database. And then after a couple seconds, we'll have our report. So this is our standard measures report. And as we said, this is kind of your cover sheet. So let's go ahead and just kind of take a minute to interpret this report. There's a ton of numbers Important to just kind of conceptualize. The left-hand side is all of the student or speaker measures. The right-hand side is the database measures. So that's kind of the averages, the means, and so forth. So we have the standard measures report compared to 24 samples that we have up here. Italicized measures are those that are equated by the same number of total words. Okay, so in general, what you want to do is go through and look at measures that are highlighted in gray. The caveat to this is that just because it's highlighted in gray doesn't necessarily mean that it's a deficit. It could be a strength. So an example might be if we, let's see if we can find one for Cheyenne. So let's go down and look at her errors. So percent utterances with errors. She had 4.3% of her utterances with errors, and that was below the database mean, 1 standard deviation below. So that would actually be a strength. She didn't make a ton of errors at her utterance level or word level errors. So just because it's highlighted does not mean that it's an area of deficit per se. Okay, so just that caveat is really important to understand. So this report is divided up by language domain. Her transcript length will tell you about total utterances. That looks pretty average. And all words are word count. So she had 279 words. That's a little bit lower than the database mean of 377. And it took her a little bit longer, 7 minutes and 16 seconds compared to the database mean. So it took her longer to tell that story, which makes sense since she had so many pauses and revisions in her language sample. Intelligibility was 95%, and that's a little bit low. Of course, for almost 9-year-olds, we'd expect that to be right around, near perfect percentage intelligibility. The macro analysis, this is the narrative scoring scheme. That's an additional analysis that you can score. And what that does is it looks at character development, introduction, all those narrative components. So that's something that you can find out more information on if you're interested. But that can give you a little bit of information on the macro structure. Syntax and morphology includes measures like main length of utterance in words and morphemes. Cheyenne's sentences were a little bit shorter than what would be expected. The database mean for MLU was 7.19 and hers was 5.34. Percent utterances with verbs was in the average range for her. And if we go down, we can also look at one other thing I'll point out is the SI, that's the Subordination Index Composite score. So her sample was scored where we basically counted the number of clauses per utterance. So that can be a good measure of kind of syntactic complexity. And that score was also a little bit lower than our database mean. Semantics, total number of words. We're cutting this on same number of total words, so that will be the same. Number of different words, however, she had 86 different words compared to the database average of 96. So that was a little bit lower, 1.85 lower than the database mean. The moving average number of different words, what that does is it kind of scans your transcript and goes number of different words for utterances 1 through 10 and then 2 through 11. So it's just a more kind of robust measure if we do a moving average rather than just total average. So also that number was a little bit lower. And then verbal facility. So this is the words per minute, pause time, mazes. That's definitely an area of relative challenge for Cheyenne. So her words per minute, her speaking rate was a little bit slower. We noticed she had those kind of very long, almost kind of painful pauses within her transcript. So there's, it's not a surprise. So pause time as percent of total time was 42%. So that's pretty significant. That number, again, is higher than the database mean. So she's spending more time in a pause. So that would be an area of relative challenge for her. And also maze words as percent of total words. So how many of her words were us, I mean, where she's doing these repetitions and revisions, and it's almost 20%, which is significant. As well as abandoning utterances. So 4% of her utterances, she just couldn't quite formulate an utterance and she just abandoned it and moved on. So those can be indicative of language impairment. Okay, so again, this is just kind of the gross overview with tons of data points. So let's go in and look at our reports that are kind of already ready to go. So one thing that I like to do if I'm going into an IEP or a meeting is to look at the quick look. So what the quick look does, again, we have the report based on, I'm going to take the default and do entire transcript. is just this really simple, easy to understand report with no numbers. It simply marks the measures as a strength within normal limits or as a weakness. So this can be great to go in and just have, and it's very readable for parents and teachers. And we can say, oh, one of Cheyenne's strengths is she doesn't make a lot of errors in her whole utterance. However, she's really struggling with kind of those verbal facility measures that we talked about, her pause time and being able to formulate utterances easily. So those can be relative weaknesses, but it's really nice to just have something very simple, easy to read if you're in meetings. And then let's go, and I'm just going to show you the performance report as well. So what this does, you hit performance report again under the database menu. And this just helps us set up the report. So I'm going to keep her name to Cheyenne, and the pronouns in the report are female. And we'll hit OK. And then what this is everything written out in a narrative format. So this can be really handy. What I do is I paste this into my electronic medical record system, and it does light interpretation for you. So it kind of helps guide your analysis, and this can be saved or copied and put into Microsoft Word or whatever you want, and then you can also edit this as you see fit. So if there's changes, you can just add with whatever you want here. You can just type it in there and make any changes that you want. So your report is already done for you in just a couple seconds. And then the other kind of already made for you is the goal bank, and this is new to SALT 2024 version. And this also is really quick and handy. And again, we're going to take her name and keep that as Cheyenne. Okay, so then what you have is, based on the transcript, it's going to input your baseline data into a goal. Again, these are completely editable, so go ahead and change these. Everyone has kind of a different way to format their goal, but it's a draft and it kind of directs potential therapy targets. So please use clinical judgment when using these, but it kind of takes any measure that was a relative weakness and then drafts a goal for it. So for example, under syntax and morphology, these are some potential goals. So it has, given a story retell opportunity, Cheyenne will increase mean length of utterance and morphemes from 5.95 to 6.9, improving expressive language skills, and so forth. So what this does is the baseline data is her measure, and then the 2 part of the goal, the criterion, is kind of what would be typical for her given that age. And some of these, if it's a count measure, we can't calculate the percentage for the baseline, but it directs you as to areas of relative weakness. So an example might be, given a story retell opportunity, Cheyenne will use adverbs in sentences with 80% accuracy in 3 consecutive sessions. Again, that's maybe not the exact formatting that you want to use, but it guides you as far as potential targets. So for Cheyenne, there's tons of goals to work on, and obviously you probably wouldn't do all of these, but it can kind of direct your therapy targets. So again, the goal report, the performance report, and then the quick look are great for just very clinical kind of guiding and sharing your information with others. Okay, so if we wanted, I'm going to go back to our standard measures report. I might want to dig down another level and look at these areas of relative challenge. So one might be the verbal facility. So if I go into my database and I go to the verbal facility section, I'm going to hit the verbal facility summary. And I'm going to take the default that it's a combination of all unequated utterances. Okay, and then what this report will do is give me even more detail on verbal facility skills. So it kind of breaks down the pauses. I like to look at the pause summary. So pauses within utterances. So she had 11 within utterance pauses, and then it gives you the total pause time and the average pause time. Pauses between utterances. The number of pauses was 21. So I could say mostly she's having more difficulty with pausing between her utterances. There's almost twice as many as within utterance pauses. So that might be something that I'd kind of work on in therapy. Like, okay, what strategies could we give Cheyenne to kind of think about, formulate her sentences? So there's just tons of information on pausing. If we go down to the maze summary, so mazes are repetitions, revisions, and those filled pauses. It breaks down the mazes. So if I go down to total maze components, there's 35. It looks like she's kind of, revisions part word and repetitions part word. She's kind of, about the same for revisions and repetitions. And then a few filled pauses. So she's not using so many ums and uhs, the filled pauses, but more those part word revisions or repetition. So, and then total maze components as percent of total component is 12%. So that might be kind of some more information too that would guide your therapy. And then let's go and look at the semantic summary as well. We'll click OK. Okay, so then this kind of gives you just a breakdown of some semantic skills and different standard type word lists. So it has information about our number of total words and number of different words up at the top. Again, anything in gray is at least one standard deviation away from the mean. So she is using, if we look at negatives, conjunctions, it can kind of give us more information there. So this kind of, if we see total conjunctions, for example, she used 9, and that's 1.64 standard deviations less than the database mean. So that maybe makes sense given her a little bit lower MLU. She's not using quite robust, complex sentences. So that's just an example of some reports that you might want to run. Now that we've finished analyzing Cheyenne's sample, let's go over to saltsoftware.com so I can show you a few of our additional resources. Here we are on the home page. As mentioned before, we have tons of training materials. So we have self-paced online courses, tons of YouTube videos, and also step-by-step exercises. If you're interested for instructors, we have a toolkit as well. So let's go up to the self-paced online courses. And as you can see, we have a lot of classes that are offered. Some of these are available for professional development hours. They're not ASHA CEUs, but if you're keeping track of your own hours, there is a certificate of completion with these courses. They have been timed. So we have an introduction to LSA, language sample analysis. There's a couple on elicitation. And then all of the 1300 series are on transcription. As we talked about earlier, if you want to learn to transcribe yourself, there's tons of resources here. I would recommend starting with 1300, the transcription quick start, to get you up and running. And then we have more detail on analysis in the 1400 series. And then, as we had talked about, the subordination index and the narrative scoring scheme also have independent courses where you can learn a lot more information about those analysis that you can complete on your transcript. And the 1600 is all about bilingual Spanish-English elicitation. So be sure to check out these courses if you're interested in more training. And also, if we go down to resources, that's a great place to look. We have everything that you might need as far as database summary by grade, which is there. And then also elicitation aids. So here is anything that would help you with the elicitation. So all of the scripts are here and the audio files and so forth that we have for elicitation. So I just wanted to point out everything that we have on our webpage. Make sure to go ahead and check it out. Thanks for listening to Intro to SALT Software and Language Sample Analysis. We really take pride in excellent customer service at the SALT office, so please feel free to contact us. We're here to help you out as much as we can with SALT software and language sample analysis. So here's our contact information.